With every new Fire Emblem game, features get added, removed, refined, or completely reset. Pair-up was different in Fates than it was in Awakening, and completely changed with adjutants in Three Houses. Capture has had 2 iterations in the series, but has yet to make a comeback since Fates. Personally, I never really know what I actually want in Fire Emblem when it comes to a new mechanic. With every entry though, they bring something either revolutionary for the genre, something perhaps a bit unrefined but with a ton of potential, or something game-defining that Fire Emblem has never done before. There's a reason why this series has lasted so long and keeps winning. Don't get it twisted. Fire Emblem is going to have a banger mechanic in some way, whether it's a gameplay one, or it has a wicked story, or it has strong character focus. On the other hand, it's much easier to talk about what Fire Emblem doesn't need from its plethora of mechanics and features from games past. Fire Emblem loves revisiting its old mechanics and bringing them back. The developers are even on record saying as much. But what this editorial video concerns itself with today is, what are some of these features, mechanics, and overall design decisions that the series doesn't need? Super obvious warning, but these are all my opinion. And several of these topics will require a lot more reasoning and nuance than others. What doesn't Fire Emblem need is already a really ambiguous question. Does it need to be what? Good, fun, monetarily successful? Now, while I could try to convince you guys that this video is a video about things in Fire Emblem that don't provide a net positive contribution to the series when they're done this way, or something that's like beating around the bush, I won't sugarcoat it. This video is straight up about things in Fire Emblem that I don't like and features that in their current form could be done way better. At this point, I can recite the mechanics that I want to come back whenever people ask me in an Ask Gast. But when someone asks what shouldn't make a return, that really makes me think, and that's what this video is for. So yeah, don't get mad at me if something that you like is on this list. I'll be organizing these from simplest to ones that require a bit more explanation, so the video paces itself better than if I just started randomly talking about a more nuanced topic than another. But first, a message from Hoyoverse. Zenless Zone Zero is Hoyoverse's new game. This urban action RPG set in the future lets you control various unique characters, each armed with their own set of special weapons and skills, which you can fluidly switch between in real time. This game mixes its story presentation with a fully voiced, colorful, and flashy comic style alongside well-animated and lively pre-rendered and in-game cutscenes. And much like its dynamic character and story demonstration, the gameplay is loaded with captivating visuals oozing with style. Meant to perfectly combine impact and fluidity, it's made to have a low barrier of entry and a high skill ceiling. The game has currently entered its 2nd beta test, and so far, I've personally been having a really fun time with the game. The combat is especially fun and snappy. From art direction to the fights, there's a ton of attention to detail. You can check out Zenless Zone Zero today and register for its 2nd beta test when it comes out using the link in the pinned comment. And thank you Hoyoverse for providing me the early access. Let's start with some easy pickings. Limited save slots. Due to memory limitations of consoles past, Fire Emblem's older titles couldn't have more than a handful of save slots at a time. The series had jumped between 3 to 5 slots, and the DS games continued this trend, which according to the developers was still limited to 3 due to the console's limits. But the restrictions were truly broken in the 3DS era, where in Fates for example, the game had initially 3 slots for each cartridge, while the special edition had 9, with the logic, I guess, being 3 slots for Conquest, Birthright, and Revelation. While convenient, it did show IS's hand that restricting save slots to the traditional 3 to 5 was a thing of the past, and built the expectations that more slots would be the norm, except they went backwards on this. Three Houses started with 5 on release, then raised it to 25 through version 1.2.0. 7 months after launch. Understandably, this was probably requested because 5 was not nearly enough to cover 4 routes, but not even having the foresight to realize 5 would pose this issue, then waiting 7 months to fix this was wild. Meanwhile, Engage has 10 and has never updated it. The series is on the right track at the moment, but should a remake come out, I really hope they don't move backwards once again. Echoes, for example, had only 3 save slots, when it was proven you could triple that. 10 works as a minimum, but we don't need to go back to the Dark Ages with 3 if Genealogy were to get remade. Same turn reinforcements, otherwise known as ambush spawns, are enemy reinforcements that appear at the start of their turn or at the end of yours, meaning once they appear, they can attack you immediately upon appearing and potentially devastate your units and ruin your run, either forcing a game over or an important unit loss, causing the player to reset, or at least be compelled to. While yes, this is low-hanging fruit, that doesn't mean Intelligent Systems hasn't stopped experimenting with the idea. Historically, it has appeared in every Fire Emblem game up until FE7 and 8. FE9 had some as well, but they were unique circumstances or spawned from so far away in the two instances they appeared in that they were not a threat to begin with. It came back with a vengeance in Fire Emblem Awakening's Lunatic difficulty, was mostly absent in Fates, Conquest's endgame had it but it appeared from far away, then made a return in Three Houses Maddening and were not present at all in Engage. There is no guarantees that they would just throw in some same turn reinforcements for the next new title if that isn't a remake of an older one. When these reinforcements are implemented, it goes without saying that not giving the player any time to prepare for them is not fair. How are you supposed to strategize when you're given no warning? In fairness, there is a reason that the more modern titles have reserved ambush spawns for harder difficulties. It's expected that you should be prepared for more difficult versions of the chapters you've already played. I mean, if you played Awakening on normal and saw enemies appear from a fort, shouldn't you just expect those very same enemies to appear in the same location, but just at the start of their turn? There is a certain level of preparedness one can have when it comes with dealing with ambush spawns when you know they're coming, either by the game outright telling you that reinforcements will appear in a certain area, or the game follows traditional rules of spawning enemies from forts, or stairs, that kind of thing, which subtly tells you to place units on the forts to block them from appearing. But the problem is that regardless of how you cut it, it actively discourages faster-paced playstyles and makes the player think they need to proceed a chapter with way more caution than necessary in fear of flying enemies appearing from behind you or something. Three Houses was egregious with its ambush spawns, especially in the late game where in lower difficulties you could have time to move around the high movement Falco and Wyvern riders, but in Maddening, they appear, fly at you from their spawn locations, and you can't really predict or block off without slowing your pace down significantly and attacking your units. Having ambush spawns appear but from a far distance where they are not immediately threatening defeats the purpose as well. Like in Path of Radiance, making the instance where ambush spawns are not really bullshit also makes them not matter at all, and you may as well just reinforce them normally. I've always been of the opinion, and I think a lot of people agree with me here, that ambush spawns are artificial difficulty. They risk ruining a run or chapter because they're BS. They're also, in my opinion, lazy map design choices. Just try harder. Incomplete support ranks. Traditional support rankings go from C to A, offering 3 opportunities for characters to talk to each other and develop a friendship or a romantic relationship, but also serves the tactical purpose of strengthening non-permanent stats like hit, avoid, and critical hit when they're in close proximity to one another. And yet, Three Houses had numerous instances where some support pairings just came at a dead stop at the B rank for no reason. Culprits include Hilda and Sylvain, Hilda and Annette, Sylvain and Dimitri, and the Black Eagles had it bad too. Edelgard and Petra could only go up to B, and Hubert only had B ranks with both Caspar and Linhard. From a characterization standpoint, it sucks seeing these conversations just die out, but the choices are literally random as hell. Engage, meanwhile, had a different problem. While this game had no instance of B rank only, a handful of characters, Mavier, Gregory, Celestia, and Madeline, straight up don't have any support bonuses to give to anyone beyond their hit plus 10. It genuinely feels like they forgot to give them a support bonus type, but didn't bother fixing this incredibly simple mistake. Their bonuses give an important tactical advantage in tight situations. Half-assing these don't serve a purpose and frustrating to be spoiled by. Unlimited resources. Strategy games work because the player needs to find ways to win them despite restraints on resources. The early game phase of Fire Emblem games are really representative of this. In Three Houses Maddening, when you fight Costas for real, you are pitted against a bunch of ruffians. They are all formidable foes because they are literally outright better than your units pound for pound. They take multiple hits to kill, they can almost one-shot your units, and have skills that you cannot have access to yet. But what do you have to level the playing field? Well, the player isn't a bot. The player makes use of the resources available to them. Terrain and movement restrictions on those tiles is a resource that can influence how many enemies can attack them on enemy phase, and also can increase the likelihood of you dodging an attack. Weapons and combat arts are resources resources that, when properly used, can chip enemies from far away that can allow for other units who are guaranteed to be hit on retaliation, kill the enemy before they have the chance. Units too fast to be doubled like Petra, Felix, or Leone, or units bulky enough to survive a round of combat like Dedue, are also resources. Yes, units, just like weapons, skills, combat arts, terrain, are all zeros and ones that are tools for you to win with. When you lose those tools, the game gets harder. When your unit dies and you are forced to reset the chapter, you either lose that resource forever, or you restart your progress entirely to keep that resource. This is the most important example of resource management in Fire Emblem. If you don't got units, you don't get to play the game. But if we had unlimited units of similar quality to our normal ones, which means no shitty substitute characters from FE12, or our units were immortal, like casual mode or Phoenix mode, had an astounding amount of retries, like 10 turn wheel uses which blows up the margin of error and encourages screw it strategies, or we had unlimited EXP to grind, then there's a lot less to worry about with resource management beyond leveling them for our units because they just come back anyway, or we can never make a mistake in allocating EXP or whatever resource related to progression because there's always a way to get it back without any in-game restrictions. Fire Emblem has had several games with options that provided unlimited resources. Guidance, Sacred Stones, Echoes, Awakening, and Birthright have unlimited overworld map skirmishes that served as unlimited EXP fountains. And then there were games with the traditional arena. FE1, 3, 5, and the GBA games all had ways to grind EXP and gold, but at a major risk, unit death, completely setting back the player's time investment into that unit. But traditional arenas are outdated and can never work alongside the turn wheel mechanic in its current state anyway, but I thought I'd just mention it before someone else did in the comments. Then there are games like Three Houses and Engage's Maddening, where the former is limited and there's an opportunity cost by giving up a weekend activity, and Engage's Maddening mode didn't have an infinite number of skirmishes, rather they spawned at particular chapters while being optional and usually very, very difficult to complete anyway. The problem with the first group of games is that there is no opportunity cost or limitation in-game for using it. When the resources being burnt is the player's time and patience, and their willpower to not use these resources, that's where the problem lies in my opinion. Unlimited resources aren't like same turn reinforcements where the true and based answer is just not to have them. Other SRPGs have found ways to make them unlimited while also giving them more and more marginal returns the more they're used. Project Triangle Strategy struck this balance really well. In Triangle, you could grind EXP forever, and if a unit was falling behind on that chapter's recommended level, their EXP rates would shoot up dramatically to catch them up. On the flip side, it was impossible to be overleveled because EXP rates would drop off to only gaining 1 to 3 EXP per action if one surpassed the recommended level. It was genuinely pointless to grind EXP after a certain point, only to then have a purpose again when the units fell behind their recommended level again. The rates were balanced around the fact that player creativity with unit and skill customization were the real X factors with beating the game, so everything worked together really well. With the trajectory Fire Emblem is taking right now, with more and more emphasis on player phase strategies and open reclassing, something could be adopted from their contemporaries to find a better way to provide EXP on demand. When you don't have a limitation behind an unlimited resource, the game balance can't stay consistent, and the game is designed around you to not use something they programmed in. Personally, and I know there are people who will disagree with me on this, just ignore it as an option isn't fair to the player. I think strategy games should reward the player for making creative and full use of the systems and resources provided, not for deliberately restricting themselves from everything the game has to offer so they feel consistently challenged. Unless you want to do it for fun, like a draft run or placing restrictions on yourselves after your initial playthrough, that's totally fine. I mean, people find creative ways to play the same game over and over, but as a default, it seems backwards to me. Gacha mechanics. Fire Emblem and gacha mechanics don't only exist in Heroes, but in both Fates and Engage. Fates had the lottery shop and Engage had bond rings. Granted, as I will explain, Fates did what was aesthetically a gacha, but it was no less than what Awakening had done the game before. The lottery shop was restricted to being pulled twice a day, with prizes ranging from consolationary materials to jackpot prizes, which include silver weapons, high-level staves, and stat boosters. Technically, the lottery shop is just Fates' version of Awakening's random item pickups in the barracks. They both serve as free ways to get random items that might be good, keyword being free. Engage was compelled to introduce a more literal gacha mechanic. At the cost of bond fragments, the game's currency for all things unit progression in the Somniel, at least relating to emblems, grinding emblem bond rank and unlocking emblem skills. The problem with this is that number one, you're literally gambling valued currency for potentially junk or valuable bond rings that do something in combat with a couple high-valued rings that are arguably better than Leaf's entire kit. There are only a handful of bond rings, like Claude or Olwyn's, that are worth the risk in losing bond fragments that go towards other resources. And number two, once you figure out how the RNG works for this particular mechanic, that the position of rings is directly related to how many enemy units the game sees when you load up any map in the game, there is no more gacha. The mechanic dies then and there. I don't think a feature like this is healthy for the game, and you shouldn't need to spend resources at a chance of getting a huge edge in the maps themselves, and you shouldn't need to break the mechanic in unintended ways to reap the benefits. The first four mentioned subjects were things that I feel pretty confident that most people would agree with. These are the ones that I think are more contentious though. An open reclassing system. Fire Emblem has greatly varied their reclassing system, from a brief experimentation in Gaiden, not coming back until Sacred Stones with the two-way branching class system, then making an interesting return in Shadow Dragon and New Mystery with the class set system. In Awakening, units could reclass to 2 to 3 other classes, with children being able to inherit their parents' class too. Fates had a similar system, but could reclass to 1 to 2 classes and can gain a class set from both an S rank and an A+ rank partner. 3 houses broke class sets into tiers, which required passing an exam, and finally, Engage reclassing was quite open and only required a weapon proficiency earned from emblem inheritance. The Switch-era systems are very easily accessible open class systems. Not only can basically anyone be anything, but even in 3 houses, dancers could be any student you have recruited. Fate's reclassing was very fun. It was open-ended and quite literally built from supports, so every unit could technically be any class depending on who you paired them with, while having a set class path and an alternate path from the Heart Seal. There was also more weight placed on Corrin, since your preferred class, the class you pick from your avatar creation, is your Heart Seal class, which was very reminiscent of FE12. I still look back at Fates' system, and I'm really impressed that supports were weaved into unit progression. Yes, anyone could be anything, but you had to work for it. It added an extra layer of planning that its successors just don't have. Because of how the system was restricted, units still felt like characters in the endgame. Canon class lines contribute to character identity and the game's immersion. The distinguished ease of accessibility trend of classes in the Switch era, in my opinion, also means that it's suffering from success. You would think that the possibilities are endless with something like 3 Houses' system, but such success grants access to the most top-tier builds, and many units lose their identity as their personal skills get less and less relevant as the game progresses, as well as their best classes tend to be very similar since, well, everyone can access the best class and builds in the game. You play these systems long enough, and it becomes less of the exciting anyone can be anything, and the more stale feeling of who out of everyone can be the best at the best thing. To be precise, it's not that I don't think Fire Emblem needs an open reclassing system, it's that whatever reclassing system they have, it shouldn't be wildly accessible, nor as open as its current iterations. Honestly, I think they should go back to something like Fates. Fates starts as a branching path system, but with strategic use of supports, it becomes an open class system with skill inheritance, fully rewarding the player for investing their resources, support points, and pairings. And while Fates could only be 100% open class in Revelation, as that granted access to all Hoshidan and Norian units for class pairings, you could see the potential reward for something like this in a new game with time and chapter constraints. The self-insert. Trying to write out my own grievances with the self-insert phenomenon in Fire Emblem has actually been the one thing that made this video so long to complete. I genuinely did not know how to articulate my feelings on the matter at all, because saying I don't like self-inserts is such a broad statement for a topic that means so much more than I just don't like it when Fire Emblem has an avatar or puts me in the game. What part of the self-insert is bad? Customizing your attributes, boons and banes, appearance and name? The former traits have actual gameplay purposes and give replay value. The latter doesn't have any bearing on the story, so yeah. Is it because self-inserts stifle character development? Well, Robin seems to be the mascot of my units, but the main story is still largely crumbs, and Robin themselves is quite a well-written character because, like, they're a character first and foremost. What about Chris? Most of the cool FE3 Book 2 lines are still intact, and again, it's still Marth in the driver's seat. Byleth and Alir don't have much customizability as their counterparts, but I'd consider them worse off anyway, so what is happening? I genuinely don't think I have an arguable issue with self-inserts not being needed, period, and I don't really have the grounds to make much of an argument because, well, yeah, I'd personally just like the story and characters to happen without my influence, but that's just my opinion, man. People want self-inserts because they like the ability it grants to get to know their colorful bits of code. And if a story can hold its own like Awakening or Three Houses, in spite of them being there, then surely the self-insert is not the problem, right? I'm just going to spend the rest of this section being blunt as hell because I literally can't think of any other way to talk about it. The problem is the unnatural pandering to the power fantasy of the self-insert. While yes, every self-insert from Chris to Alear break the rules of their own game, yeah, they can bond with everyone and ultimately are capable of A and S ranking the entire army, which, fine. But the thing is, most avatars have performed some cardinal sin due to the developer's choices in thinking that just because the self-insert is you, that the universe needs to also revolve around you. The most non-offensive examples I can think of are Chris and Robin. And I guess Mark, if you want to count Mark. Robin has amnesia, who immediately helps the Shepherds and becomes a respected colleague and commander to them. But the story is still largely Crom's, and the universe acts natural to Robin themselves anyway. The only real red flag might be that the Avatar sexual trend started here, in that Robin could S-support the villains and M, and they couldn't S-support anybody else. And you had weirdo-obsessed characters like Tharja, and played right into the yandere archetype. It's not that Fire Emblem characters were never written around tropes before, because writing around anime influences and archetypes started way before the 3DS era. Corrin and Alear have these very blatant instances of pandering, like face-blowing and literally kissing you in the S. In Engage, they are waiting for you to wake up from your god nap. That has this juxtapositive effect, where these characters treat you like you're in the universe, but they act so unnatural when they do it, it feels completely mechanical and forced. Why are my two maids looking directly at me when I wake up? How come random people who just joined my army are staring at me while I sleep and have something ready to tell me about how I look? Can I be a self-insert without being literally fucking god to these people? Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying avatars in Fire Emblem can't feel special, or that I disagree with the notion that characters will gravitate towards you. We're playing a simulation game, and there's of course suspension of disbelief required for you to buy into the behavior of these characters. But I think of all these POV segments of these games on a spectrum. Awakening's CG Robin wake-up cutscene, Fates' Northern Fortress opening, and Engage's nap wake-ups all show the same thing, someone waking up from being asleep. But Awakening's is the only one that feels natural. Like two people would actually be holding a conversation out of concern for someone they just found on the ground, whereas the other two don't. Tea time, expeditions, and mealtime are written around the idea that you are going to spend time getting to know your allies in a setting that makes sense. There are some silly fan service things like zooming in on them, but it definitely feels more convincing of something that happens in real life. The developers want the player to feel special, like you are part of the world. So if the question is, are self-inserts good for the series, I would say, I guess, but not at the expense of having characters act in unnatural ways, or in ways that are trying to not so subtly suck me off. If you want to create a self-insert, sure, there are literal gameplay implications and replay value there, like the way FE12, Awakening, and Fates did. But when narratively, they're at the center of the universe and the characters are quick to follow suit, that's what gets me to scoff and roll my eyes. Anyways, I feel like I'm talking myself in circles at this point, but I'm confident that you understand what I mean. Too long didn't watch, don't be cringe. Well everybody, that will do it for today's video. This one was interesting to write about, simply because these were issues I've always never really thought were done well, or were good ideas, but I never really plot them all in a video before. Also, there were some that I wanted to write about, but didn't end up because I didn't really have enough experience with the history of them in the series, or that my complaints were more so just personal dislikes that I didn't think were necessarily done badly or anything, or clearly had a positive trajectory, one where I could just point and say, they're probably gonna get it right eventually. I do think there's something to be said about Fire Emblem's recent DLC practices being basically on disk, being partitioned off, as well as the series' traversable hub areas needing more work and optimization, but Fire Emblem seems to recognize this at least with its progressive optimization of them. I'm very curious as to what your personal complaints or your thoughts on improving something that already exists in the series is. I do want to make the opposite of this video too, because, like I mentioned at the beginning, the things this series has come up with are genuinely, actually revolutionary for the series and the genre. Because I do genuinely want to gush about the mechanics that are among my favorites, things that I routinely talk about like capture mechanics, prep screen evolution, the weapon triangle and how that makes different iterations around. I think there's so many cool things that the series does that I definitely do want to just gush about eventually. As always, please leave a like and of course comment down below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, but you like my scripted Fire Emblem videos, you can do that as well. Thanks for watching. Deuces.